Coming up on WAB's Week in Review, both the father and the son in the Apalachee High School shooting that killed 4 people were sentenced in a first for Georgia. Plus, Georgia's largest healthcare system is set to cut hundreds of jobs. And the big disagreement between the state and the city of Atlanta for who is to blame for a massive fish kill in the South River. This is WAB's Week in Review, the show where we look back the last few days of stories from your WAB News team. I'm Alex Helmick, managing editor of WAB News. Coming up a little later on the show, as sea levels rise due to climate change, Georgia's coastal marshes will need to rise too.
Remember Jurassic Park, like nature can always find a way.
Efforts to protect not just the marsh, but the land next door. But first, 1 week, 2 separate cases, and hopefully some semblance of closure for those who lost loved ones or suffered because of the Apalachee School shooting in 2024. The teenager who killed 4 people at Apalachee High was sentenced to life without parole Tuesday, days after he pleaded guilty to all 55 charges against him. WAB's Shemaine Cruz covered the case.
Colt Gray was 14 years old in 2024 when he brought the assault-style rifle that his father gifted him for Christmas to school and opened fire. Both the prosecution and the defense agree that the teen had a bad upbringing, but the local district attorney Brad Smith says Gray's motive was to mimic other mass shooters for fame and notoriety within the true crime community.
I want everyone to realize this is not harmless. The things they're doing online are not harmless, and we need to pay attention to when these kids start doodling these things on their notebooks.
Then on Thursday, in an historic first for Georgia, Colt Gray's father, who gave the teen the assault-style rifle used in the mass shooting, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. That came after a jury convicted the 55-year-old Colin Gray of second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter in March. Here again, Shemaine Cruz.
The judge says that while Colin Gray failed as a parent, he ultimately did not have actual knowledge of his son's plan or intend to commit a crime. But Barrow County District Attorney Brad Smith thinks the father deserved a tougher sentence of 80 years in prison for failing to act as the teen's mental health deteriorated.
Colt Gray was 14 years old and had no access to firearms except the one his father gave him, knowing that he was already a threat to schools.
Shemaine Cruz, WABE News, the Barrow County Courthouse.
Switching gears now, Georgia's largest healthcare system is cutting hundreds of jobs. WAB's Jess Mador had the details.
Wellstar has announced it's cutting 761 jobs, amounting to about 2% of its workforce. In a statement, a Wellstar spokesman says the layoffs are intended to streamline operations. They affect its corporate, shared services, and administrative offices. The cuts are not affecting frontline healthcare workers, officials say. The workforce reduction follows several years of growth for Wellstar, with a number of new medical centers open or under construction, including in Paulding County and Ackworth, and the closure of Atlanta Medical Center hospitals in the Old Fourth Ward and East Point in 2022. Wellstar officials say all employees affected by the layoffs have already been notified. Jess Mador, WABE News.
2 Democratic candidates will face off in a special runoff election to serve Georgia's 13th Congressional District. WAB's Dormaya Vance tells us about it.
Candidates Marcy Scott and Everton Blair Jr. will go another round on August 25th to fill the seat left by Scott's late father, Congressman David Scott. Scott and Blair were on the ballot with 3 other candidates. Scott just barely missed winning 50% of the vote by 4 points, while Blair reeled in just over 37% of voters. The runoff will determine who will finish out the rest of the late congressman's term, which runs through the end of the year. Scott served District 13 for over 20 years before his passing. Meanwhile, the November general election will decide who will serve the full 2-year term starting in 2027. Dormaya Vance, WABE News.
Georgia businesses are preparing to weather another potential round of tariffs, this time on Canada. WABE's Marlon Hyde reported the details.
President Donald Trump recently implemented new import taxes on more than 60 countries and 99% of U.S. trade, and announced an additional 50% tariff on specific Canadian goods, like lumber and machinery.
It presents a lot of challenges for companies that are trying to do business. It is almost impossible to forecast and plan if the plans keep changing.
That's Tom Smith, an economist at Emory University. According to the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, Canada is Georgia's largest export market, receiving about $7 billion in Georgia exports in 2025. Canada is also the state's fourth largest total trade partner. He says other goods like plastics, lumber, and dairy could rise in price, impacting consumers that are already facing hefty fuel costs.
Now an increase in tariffs and an increase in reciprocal tariffs, most likely, that's going to add an additional burden on top of what is already very constrained households.
Sino Golar is a supply chain expert at Georgia State University.
I'm not sure if I can pinpoint one particular industry that's extremely vulnerable, but basically everyone will suffer.
Golar says he expects businesses to ramp up ordering.
They're going to scramble to get things on this side of the border as fast as possible. And that's not going to be cheap. You have to pay extra to make that happen. But that would be a way to at least avoid parts of these tariff effects.
The Georgia Chamber of Commerce is making recommendations to business owners, like monitoring implementation, negotiations with Canada, and the potential for retaliatory tariffs by the effective date of August 19th. Marlon Hyde, WABE News.
After weeks of investigation, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources says the city of Atlanta is at fault for a late June fish kill in the South River. But as WABE's Marissa Mecki reported, the city disagrees.
In a report released Monday, the DNR's Wildlife Resources Division stated approximately 1,200 fish died in the South River due to a chemical spill from the city of Atlanta's South River Water Reclamation Center. A local resident reported the fish kill on June 27th. But the city of Atlanta is pushing back. A Department of Watershed Management spokesperson wrote in a statement to WABE, the report is based on circumstantial evidence. Jackie Eccles, director of the South River Watershed Alliance, says she's surprised the city is rejecting the state's findings.
It's very detailed report. Obviously, a lot more fish were killed than I even imagined. 1,200 fish in the South River in the headwaters is a lot.
She said the city hasn't provided an alternative explanation for what caused the fish kill. Meanwhile, the Wildlife Resources Division concluded the city is at fault based on field observations, water quality patterns, and a documented spill of ferric chloride reported by the city that most likely reached the river via a storm drain.
They did their due diligence. It's evident in the report, and they did it right.
But she says there's always more work to be done to protect the South River, and this fish kill is only a small part of the larger enforcement battles happening in the river basin. The Georgia Environmental Protection Division did not specify what comes next. However, in many cases like this, the state proposes a fine and comes to a settlement with the city, including payments or necessary changes. Marissa Mecki, WABE News.
A public survey from the Georgia Department of Transportation on potential passenger rail service between Atlanta and Savannah closes August 6th. WABE's Raul Bali took a look at the larger study behind the project.
How much are you willing to pay for a ticket? Does it make a difference whether the trip is 5 hours or 2.5 hours? That's the kind of questions GDOT is asking Georgians in this survey. Athens, Augusta, Macon, Milledgeville, Statesboro, and other cities could be stops along the route depending on what the proposed service looks like, whether it's commuter rail, intercity rail, or high-speed rail. The eventual goal of the $10 million study is to produce a plan by early 2028 detailing who or what would fund, build, and operate the rail service. We have a link to the survey and study at wabe.org. Raul Bali, WABE News.
You're listening to WABE's Week in Review with me, Alex Helmick. For more, check out the WABE app, where you can listen live, read the latest news about Metro Atlanta, check on the latest events, and see our news videos. The WABE app. A new action plan for Georgia's coastal salt marsh calls for not just protecting the existing marsh, but also giving it room to migrate. Georgia is home to hundreds of thousands of acres of salt marsh, a critical buffer against storms. But as WAB's Emily Jones reported, as sea levels rise due to climate change, the marsh will likely need to move.
At a creekside park nestled between the town of Midway and I-95, marsh grass stretches out to fill the space between solid ground and the nearby water. But along the park's other bank,
as we walk that way, you'll be able to see some of the, just plain erosion.
Phil Odom is chairman of Liberty County's Consolidated Planning Commission. The bank is shorn away sharply where he walks, the marsh grass halting abruptly where it meets the base of a small, muddy cliff.
That was the edge. This is how much it has collapsed. We've lost about 6-8 feet right here.
Decades ago, construction of the highway left a deep pit here. This park is miles from the ocean, but high tide washes up this creek twice a day, year after year. That's steadily eaten away at the land while depositing sediment in the basin. Now it's a shallow mud flat with little islands of marsh grass cropping up in the middle, up against a bank at risk of collapse. Local leaders are hoping to fix that erosion at the water's edge so the marsh can continue to gradually populate this area.
We hope for it to replicate nature.
Shannon Marino is with Zulu Marine, which builds what are known as living shorelines.
When our solutions are done, you should look at it and not really recognize it as a repair or a bulkhead or a solution, or it should just look like nature.
This is an effective and increasingly popular way to address coastal erosion issues in the face of rising seas. But it's also just one step, and Georgia's marshes need more help than living shorelines alone. That's because the salt marshes don't just absorb the ever-rising tides and storm surges brought on by climate change. They actually move further inland as the water does. University of North Carolina wetland scientist Lori Sutter explains that as the salt water rises, it kills plants and trees that can't tolerate it.
Remember Jurassic Park, like nature can always find a way, right? So the plants that can handle that environment are potentially going to move in.
Those plants are the hardy grasses of the marsh. With the sea level on Georgia's coast projected to rise 1 to 2 meters in the next 75 years, the marshes will need to rise too. Sutter says they're well equipped to do that.
Because of the magic of salt marshes, right, they're able to persist in this environment where they're flooded, in Georgia twice a day, every day.
But that magic of salt marshes only works if they have somewhere to go. Once a migrating marsh encounters a paved road or a building, that's a dead end. There's nowhere for new grasses to take root. The rising tide can sweep in unabated, flooding the marsh and that road or building. That's why a new action plan by a coalition of conservation groups, scientists, government agencies, and coastal communities calls for protecting not just the salt marsh itself, but also the land next door, so the marshes have room to creep in.
That creates this really vast area that you're trying to conserve, which can be overwhelming, right?
Courtney Reich is the coastal director for Georgia Conservancy, which is spearheading the Georgia work under the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, a multi-state effort to restore and protect coastal salt marshes. The plan identifies more than 56,000 acres of land in Georgia where marshes will likely migrate that are currently open to development. It's a roadmap, not binding policy, not seizing anyone's land. And Reich says it would be expensive and impractical to buy all that land for conservation. Instead, she says, the plan's authors hope it can help landowners and public officials make informed decisions.
Do we want to build up to the edge of the water, or do we want to leave room?
Reich says short-term needs often drive land use conversations. This plan aims to get people thinking about the long view. Emily Jones, WABE News, Midway.
This story is part of a partnership with Grist. And finally, today, WABE is checking out Atlanta area museums and archives to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States. We're looking at the stories the objects in their collections tell about the country's history. WABE's Molly Samuel took us to the MIMS Museum of Technology and art.
Lonnie Mims got into computers as a kid growing up in Atlanta.
I took classes at the Fernbank Science Center every summer.
He went to Georgia Tech, and all along he held on to old stuff.
Every computer that got cast off, I would save, that people were throwing them away or they were, giving them away. And it eventually got to be a very significant collection.
Then he started buying other people's collections. Now the museum in Roswell has art exhibits, tech going back to looms and abacuses, a computer from NASA's Apollo mission, the servers powering data centers, just about every Apple product you can imagine.
At this point in time, we probably have well over 500,000 artifacts.
And the item Mims chooses to talk about is an old wooden crate about the size of a shoebox with glass jars connected by metal stuck into it.
A very early battery.
He says it's probably from the early 1900s and might have been used to power something like a telegraph, for instance.
What I think is probably the most significant technology or technological discovery during the time of our country is electricity and the distribution of electricity. Because without that, nothing else happens.
He points out interest in electricity goes back to the country's founding. Remember Benjamin Franklin and the story about the key attached to a kite? And the country has continued to lead in technology and science, oftentimes developed by immigrants.
It's hard not to see us as just being this gravity well where bright people can come and see their ideas take shape.
Molly Samuel, WABE News.
That's all for the show this week. My thanks to the WABE News team for all the great work, and a big thanks to all of you for supporting WABE News. I'm Alex Helmick. Thanks for listening to The Week in Review.